The air once shimmered with wings too vast for imagination. Long before the first dinosaurs, before flowers, before birds or mammals or grass, Earth was a green ocean made of trees, moss, and mist. The continents were swamp and fern, the sky a haze of vapor. And somewhere in that wet twilight, wings opened, vast, trembling membranes that caught the heavy air and lifted silently into a world thick with breath. It was not yet a world made for sound. There were no birds to cry, no mammals to murmur, no wind to whisper through leaves that had not yet learned to rustle. Only the slow hum of insects, enormous, deliberate, ancient, turning the air itself into music. Somewhere between myth and science lies the question: how did the world allow such creatures to exist? How could a dragonfly grow the size of a hawk? How could a millipede stretch longer than a crocodile? The fossil record tells us they were real. The mystery is not that they lived, but that they could. What kind of earth made such air possible? If we walked through that world, barefoot through black water, the ground soft and ancient, we would feel the planet breathing through the soil. Oxygen was not what it is today. It was abundance, almost excess. Scientists studying fossilized charcoal and trapped air bubbles have estimated that oxygen once filled 35% of the atmosphere, enough to make the air itself flammable, to turn a single spark into a forest fire. It was a time when breathing was not survival, but intoxication. The forests that shaped this air were unlike any we know. They were not built from wood as we understand it, not yet flowering, not yet diverse. They were towers of bark and sponge, tree ferns and club mosses like lepidodendron and sigillaria, their trunks hollow, patterned like the skin of reptiles, their spores drifting in dense clouds. Each plant reached toward the damp light, building the first skyscrapers of life, turning sunlight into oxygen with a greed that would change the entire planet. In the quiet of those swamps, everything was amplified. Insects ruled not by tooth or claw, but by volume and persistence. A single dragonfly, Meganeura, could fill a clearing with the slow pulse of its wings. The air carried their rhythm the way our air carries music. And beneath the canopy, millipedes the size of snakes moved through ferns like trains through grass. Scorpions crept out of the water and learned the silence of land. Even the ground seemed alive, built from the decay of older generations, soaked with millions of years of fallen leaves. But behind this lushness there was imbalance, the kind of imbalance that cannot last. Oxygen was both gift and danger. Too much of it meant fires that burned endlessly, consuming the very forests that created it. Fossilized layers of ancient charcoal tell of continents that burned under lightning storms, the air flickering red for weeks. It's strange to imagine a world so alive that it had to destroy itself to survive. And yet, that same destruction preserved its memory. Those forests did not die in vain. Buried under mud and water, their remains became the coal seams we mine today. Every spark in a modern city, every flame lighting a home, carries a whisper from those forgotten trees. The energy of the Carboniferous still hums in our power lines. We burn the breath of that age without realizing we are breathing it again. Still, the question lingers. What does it mean that such a world existed and then ended? Was it nature's mistake or a deliberate reset? Life expanded too fast, oxygen rose too high, and the planet corrected itself. Some scientists call it equilibrium. Others quietly call it an accident. But perhaps it is something deeper. The planet experimenting with the chemistry of being alive. And if we listen carefully, we can still hear its echo. In the fossil beds of Mason Creek in Illinois, in the coal cliffs of Nova Scotia, in the wet brown stone of France, The outlines of wings and bark remain pressed like memory into rock. They are not messages from another world, but from another breath. When scientists measure the isotopes in those stones, they are measuring air. Air that once filled the lungs of a dragonfly larger than a bird. Sometimes, when you stand in a forest today, when you feel the damp weight of summer air and hear the soft whine of insects, you are standing inside a diluted version of that same atmosphere. You are breathing what they left behind. You are walking on the compressed bodies of trees that built the first empire of life. And all of it, the air, the soil, the carbon in your own cells, remembers the time when the world itself was one long inhalation. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it there, in your part of this breathing planet? Because somewhere between your breath and theirs lies the story of how air became life, and how life learned for the first time to rise on wings. If you could touch the air of that forgotten age, it would feel heavier than any breeze you've ever known, as if the sky itself were pressing closer to the ground. Every breath would taste like damp bark, iron, and pollen. The world then was not silent, but everything that moved did so slowly, as if sound itself needed more effort to travel. The Carboniferous Earth was a greenhouse wrapped in mist, a planet that exhaled forests and inhaled oceans, caught in the strange equilibrium of its own abundance. No human eyes have ever seen that world, yet its fingerprints remain on every coal seam, every fossilized trunk, every layer of shale where a fern leaf rests as if freshly fallen. Scientists call it the Age of Coal, but that name hides its true nature. It was not only an age of fuel, it was an age of breath. The entire atmosphere was alive, sustained by forests that reached 100 feet high, each leaf a small green lung pumping oxygen into the sky. But the question still lingers. How did air, an invisible thing, become the most powerful architect of life? It began in the swamps. There, the roots of the first trees reached into stagnant pools rich with decaying matter. As they grew, they released oxygen far faster than anything could consume it. The insects multiplied. The amphibians thickened their skin. Fire became easier to summon. The planet transformed itself into a breathing paradox. More life meant more oxygen, and more oxygen meant more fire. Fossil evidence shows that lightning storms swept through these forests constantly, igniting the canopy and leaving behind endless fields of charcoal. Layers of that ancient carbon still lie buried beneath our feet. And yet, even as it burned, life continued to thrive. The very same processes that should have destroyed these ecosystems seemed to renew them instead. Out of ash, new spores rose. Out of floods, new forests grew taller. The planet was not dying. It was experimenting. When researchers study fossil charcoal and trapped gas bubbles, they find that oxygen levels once climbed past thresholds that today would make breathing impossible. It's as if the earth itself were intoxicated, breathing too deeply, too freely. Insects responded with impossible size. Giant dragonflies like Meganeura needed the dense air to support their wings. Their tracheal systems couldn't survive in our modern atmosphere. They are literal memories of oxygen's excess, a species born from the weight of breath. And yet, that abundance carried a price. High oxygen meant volatility. Even the smallest spark could ignite a forest. It meant that the very mechanism sustaining life could also erase it. The boundary between creation and destruction blurred. Some paleobotanists believe this balance, this thin line between breath and flame, was the first form of planetary self-regulation. Not through intention, but through chemistry. The Earth was already learning how to keep itself alive. Imagine standing within one of those forests, the air humming, the trees rising like green cathedrals. Beneath your feet, roots and mud twist together, a slow dance of decay. Every few minutes, you hear a wing beat the size of thunder. The temperature never falls below humid warmth. You are surrounded by the sound of dripping water and the faint hiss of air escaping from the soil. It feels almost human, this breathing ground, as if the entire planet were exhaling around you. Modern science still struggles to understand exactly how such conditions came to be. Some geochemists argue that massive burial of organic matter, the very creation of coal, trapped carbon dioxide underground, letting oxygen dominate. Others point to microbial evolution, suggesting new forms of bacteria began producing oxygen faster than it could be used. Each explanation is partial, each one a fragment of a much larger mystery. But together, they suggest that this over-oxygenated Earth was not a stable paradise, but a fleeting chemical dream. It is hard not to see poetry in that. A planet that inhaled too deeply, creating giants too large to survive, forests too dense to endure, and skies too rich to last. Nature was writing its first tragedy, one that would later repeat itself in different forms. Ecosystems rising too fast, collapsing under their own abundance. The age of giant insects was perhaps the first warning that even balance can become excess. And somewhere within that imbalance, life began to prepare for its next leap. Amphibians crawled onto the land, still wet from their ocean birth, carrying with them lungs shaped by this oxygen-rich world. The air that once lifted dragonflies also taught vertebrates how to breathe. Every inhalation was a rehearsal for the creatures to come. Reptiles, mammals, us. When paleontologists open the stone layers that preserve these memories, they are opening lungs made of time. The patterns of bark, the delicate veins of leaves, the wings pressed flat by pressure, all reveal a record not of death, but of respiration. These fossils still contain traces of the chemistry that once filled the atmosphere. We can measure it, calculate it, name it, but we cannot truly imagine it, because what was it like to live in a world where every breath burned brighter than fire? To exist in an age where even the rain smelled of oxygen, and every spark of lightning could ignite continents? The answer is buried not in textbooks, but in the way the Earth still moves, breathing through storms, forests, and oceans, as if recalling a rhythm it once knew too well. We, too, are part of that rhythm. The oxygen in our blood was made by those first forests. The carbon in our bones was once part of the same molecules that built their trunks. When we light a match, when we inhale deeply before sleep, we are echoing their ancient exchange. Every breath we take is a continuation of theirs, a shared inheritance from a time when air itself was alive. And yet, if air can remember, it can also forget. What happens when we unbalance it again? When the fires we create burn faster than the world can recover? The story of the Carboniferous is not only the story of creation, it is a caution, a mirror. The planet has already learned once what too much life can do. In that sense, the age of giant insects never truly ended. It lingers in our atmosphere, in the hidden chemistry that connects breath to flame. Perhaps, in some way, we are still living inside that same inhalation, one that began 300 million years ago and has yet to fully exhale. Somewhere in the endless rhythm of that ancient air, life began to weave patterns of complexity no creature had ever known. Beneath the towering ferns and club mosses, in the lowlands drowned by rain and shadow, forests rose like lungs made of water and light. The Carboniferous Earth did not have seasons as we know them. It breathed in long, heavy cycles, its days soaked in warmth, its nights shimmering with the glow of fungus and decay. Every surface seemed alive. Bark glistened with slime. Roots dripped with amber resin, and the soil pulsed softly. A living sponge of centuries. There were no flowers, no birdsong, no mammalian heartbeats. Yet the world was full of movement. Leaves fell into black pools that reflected nothing. Water slid through channels cut by unseen creatures. The forests whispered with wings and legs. Slow, deliberate sounds of insects exploring a planet that still smelled of first growth. Their world was dense and humid, a maze of green darkness broken only by rare shafts of pale sunlight that made the mist shimmer like breath caught in light. Among those living pillars crawled the rulers of that age, not dinosaurs, not reptiles, but arthropods. Their bodies were plates of armor, their legs jointed with precision, their eyes 1,000 mirrors reflecting the green fire of the swamps. They were architects of the undergrowth. The millipede Arthropleura could stretch longer than a horse, its many legs whispering across the forest floor like rain falling sideways. It ate fallen leaves and rotting wood, grinding the planet's first forests into soil. Fossils of its tracks, found in what is now Scotland and Germany, mark its passage. Long parallel grooves etched into stone, each one a record of a creature that no longer fits the air we breathe. In the canopies above, dragonflies the size of crows floated between trees, hunting other insects mid-flight. The world was filled with motion too large for the mind to hold, yet too quiet to truly hear. The sound of their wings was not a buzz, but a slow pulse, like the beating of the Earth's own heart. Scientists studying the fossils of Meganeura and Meganeuropsis still debate how such giants flew. Some believe the air's density made flight easier. That lift came from the very weight of the atmosphere itself. Others think their wings were not built for speed, but for gliding, drifting between the thick trunks as if suspended in syrup. Everywhere, the air shimmered with invisible chemistry. The balance of gases was unlike anything we could survive in today. Fires needed only a spark to bloom, yet water covered most of the land. It was a world on the edge, lush yet dangerous, vibrant yet fragile. The deeper you went into the swamps, the stranger it became. Amphibians with scales and fins shared the shallows with crustaceans that had learned to crawl. Some of these creatures would one day give rise to reptiles, but for now they were still uncertain, suspended between water and land, breathing through both skin and air. The forests themselves seemed almost conscious, as if they understood their role in the planet's breath. Every leaf that died became a promise, buried, compressed, and sealed beneath new growth. The weight of time turned them into coal, trapping the air they had once given freely. The world's first great cycle of energy had begun, and even now, when we burn that ancient carbon, we release the same oxygen that once fed the lungs of giant insects. We are literally breathing their ghosts. But beneath this beauty lay unease. The soil grew deeper, the swamps more waterlogged, and as the forests thickened, less sunlight reached the ground. Plants competed for space, their roots choking one another. Oxygen, that invisible blessing, began to waver. Some regions of the planet may have reached saturation, air so full of breath that it could no longer change. Fires raged longer, storms rumbled hotter, and whole ecosystems flickered out overnight. Yet life adapted, as it always does. It was during this slow crisis that the first reptiles appeared, small, leathery, dry-skinned survivors that no longer needed to return to water to lay eggs. They emerged quietly, unnoticed amid the roar of insect wings. But their appearance changed everything. For the first time, Life had found a way to cut itself free from the swamps. Evolution had discovered a loophole. In the fossil beds of Nova Scotia, paleontologists have uncovered reptile footprints pressed into ancient mud. Each print is a symbol of transition, the world learning to breathe differently. The amphibians had ruled the wetlands, but the reptiles would rule the dry. As the oxygen-rich forests began to fade, these creatures were already preparing for a future of scarcity. Their scales locked in moisture, their lungs pulled in less air, but used it more efficiently. Nature was rewriting the contract of life, one breath at a time, and above them, the insects still flew, oblivious, eternal, caught in the endless feast of air. They did not know their age was already ending. They did not sense the subtle shift in the planet's rhythm, the slow cooling, the draining of the swamps, the falling of oxygen. To them, the world was still endless, but time was moving differently now, quietly reshaping the map of what could exist. The age of giant insects was not a static paradise, but a fleeting moment of overabundance. Every ecological empire carries the seed of its undoing. The same breath that lifted them would one day smother them. The Earth's great experiment in oxygen was reaching its peak, and soon it would have to exhale. Yet, in the stillness between that rise and fall, something profound was born. A world that taught itself how to breathe. Every living thing since, from the smallest leaf to the human lung, carries a trace of that lesson. We do not simply inhale air, we inhale memory. When the night grows quiet and you hear the faint buzz of an insect outside your window, remember, it is a survivor of that age. A descendant of giants, still beating its wings in miniature, echoing the rhythm of a forgotten sky. The air it moves through is thinner now, but the song remains the same. A soft reminder that even the smallest life once ruled the world. The deeper we wander into that swamp of memory, the more the air seems to thicken. It becomes difficult to tell where atmosphere ends and dream begins. This was a world before blue sky. The heavens were not clear but greenish, veiled by vapor and drifting spores. Sunlight filtered down through layers of mist, touching the ground as a dim, amber haze. Everything breathed slowly, as if time itself were taking long, deliberate inhalations. The earth was still young, but already full of ghosts. The trees themselves were strange beings, half plant, half architecture. The trunks of lepidodendron rose like pillars carved from stone, their surfaces patterned in diamond shapes that once held leaves. Some reached more than 30 meters tall, but their roots were shallow, tangled mats clinging to mud rather than digging deep into the earth. They grew fast and died young, leaving behind hollow shells that filled with sediment and became fossils. In cross-section, their interiors look like cathedrals, empty spaces surrounded by structure, as if nature were already experimenting with design. And among these towering forms, other shapes began to move. Giant cockroaches scuttled along the roots, their shells glistening in the dim light. Scorpions as long as an arm hunted smaller prey in silence. There were spiders large enough to rival a human hand, though no humans yet existed to fear them. To modern eyes, it might seem a nightmare, but in truth it was harmony. Every creature a breath in the planet's slow respiration. Beneath the water's surface, the world continued. Fish still swam, though their descendants would soon abandon the sea. Amphibians clung to both realms, their eyes breaking the surface like bubbles, their skins slick with the memory of their ocean past. In their bodies, gills and lungs coexisted uneasily, as if evolution could not yet decide which world was home. Some of them crawled onto shore, leaving prints that hardened into the first sentences written on stone. Others stayed behind, trapped between two ways of breathing. We can still read their struggle in the fossils, the transitional bones, the imprints of fins turning into limbs. It's a reminder that progress in nature is never a clean line, only a series of hesitations. The Carboniferous period was filled with such hesitations. Life was experimenting wildly, reshaping itself in every direction. Insects learned flight, plants conquered height, vertebrates tested lungs. The planet itself seemed to be asking, how far can breath go before it collapses under its own abundance? Even the air bore witness to this question. Scientists who study ancient isotopes say the balance of gases during this time was unstable, fluctuating in waves rather than remaining constant. Oxygen soared, then dipped, then rose again, a pattern echoing the expansion and contraction of lungs. In a sense, the whole planet was alive, breathing through its forests, exhaling energy and inhaling decay. That rhythm has never truly stopped. It simply changed tempo. Imagine walking there at dusk. The light dims to a greenish gold, and a warm mist curls along the forest floor. You hear the slow ripple of water beneath roots, the faint crackle of insects brushing wings. The smell is overwhelming, sap, rot, and the sweetness of spores. In that moment, the air feels almost touchable, as if you could scoop it into your hands. You realize that this is not air made for us. It is too dense, too alive, too filled with another kind of breath. Modern humans would not last long in that atmosphere. Too much oxygen would inflame our lungs, spark fire in our tissues. Even a candle would flare uncontrollably. Yet to the creatures of that world, it was paradise. Their metabolisms thrived on abundance. Giant millipedes moved without strain. Dragonflies glided effortlessly. Amphibians gulped air that nourished more than it burned. Evolution had tuned every organism to a frequency we no longer share. The more scientists uncover from that era, the clearer it becomes that we live inside its legacy. The coal we burn today, those black veins beneath our cities, are time capsules from that lush world. They are the compressed bodies of ancient forests, sealed by water and pressure. When we light them, we release the Carboniferous back into the atmosphere. We resurrect that age with every spark. In a strange symmetry, our modern excess of carbon dioxide mirrors their excess of oxygen. Two extremes separated by millions of years, each threatening its own kind of collapse. Perhaps that is the hidden rhythm of Earth. Expansion, contraction, correction, breath in, breath out. Life grows too large, too powerful, and the planet draws back, resets the balance. The age of giant insects was one such breath, long, deep, and astonishing. It showed what happens when life is given too much room to grow, when the very air becomes nourishment and danger at once. Even now, the evidence of that overbreathing hides in plain sight. The banded layers of coal, the black shale, the charcoal seams, all are the sediments of respiration. When geologists hold a thin slice of coal up to the light, they are holding the carbon of leaves that once fed dragonflies. They are looking through time into a world where every breath left a scar of fire or fossil. To think of it this way is unsettling. The very thing that kept that world alive, oxygen, was also the thing that doomed it. Fires raged, climates shifted, and as the earth cooled and dried, those humid swamps began to vanish. The dragonflies lost their sky. The millipedes lost their forests. The planet had exhaled too far. And yet, something about that loss feels familiar. It is as if Earth has always known the cost of its own beauty. It gives, then retracts. It builds giants, then erases them. Perhaps it must do this to remember how to begin again. When you close your eyes tonight, Imagine that slow breath, a forest exhaling, a dragonfly hovering in heavy air, the faint crackle of unseen fire far away. The world you know grew from that rhythm. Every heartbeat, every inhale you take is part of the same ancient exchange. You are, in a quiet way, the continuation of that long-forgotten sky. At the edge of those endless swamps where land met shallow sea, the air shimmered with heat and mist. This was not the clean horizon we know, but a trembling, uncertain boundary, where continents were still learning their shape and the sky hung heavy with vapor. Here, life teetered between two worlds. Amphibians slid through black mud, their slick bodies glistening like oil. Insects hovered above them, vast and slow, their wings tracing circles through sunlight that never fully broke through. It was as if the entire planet were trapped in the first breath of dawn, neither day nor night, neither sea nor land. A world forever in between. This in-between is where everything important happened. It was here that forests became coal, water became air, and creatures that once breathed through skin began to breathe with lungs. The great experiment of oxygen was underway, and for a moment it worked too well. In that air, flames spread faster than rain could stop them. Forests burned and grew back, over and over, leaving behind a landscape that was both eternal and wounded. The soil was black with memory. Scientists today read this memory like scripture. They find layers of fossilized bark, sheets of charcoal stacked between sandstone and shale, signs of ancient combustion. They measure carbon isotopes and discover sudden spikes and drops in oxygen levels. These fluctuations suggest something alive in the planet's chemistry. A pulse, a feedback loop. Earth was not a passive rock. It was an organism testing its own limits. If you had walked there, every breath would feel thick, almost syrupy. You would hear the forest before you saw it, the slow clicking of beetles, the faint hiss of moisture evaporating from bark, the whisper of enormous wings above. There was no horizon, only an endless canopy of club moss and fern. The air tasted metallic, rich with decay and pollen. Each gust carried spores the size of dust motes, drifting through beams of amber light. The forest did not move fast, but it felt alive in every direction. The giants of that age were not predators as we imagine them. They did not roar or hunt in packs. Their power was quiet, patient, methodical. The millipede Arthropleura ruled the ground without claws or teeth, a peaceful colossus feeding on rotting plants, turning death into soil. Dragonflies, vast as crows, patrolled the air like slow gods, their flight paths unchanged for hours. These were creatures of abundance, born not from competition, but from saturation. In a world that overflowed with oxygen, size was not conquest. It was inevitability. Yet, abundance breeds fragility. When the balance began to shift, even slightly, everything built upon it started to crumble. Some scientists believe that as trees evolved thicker bark and deeper roots, they locked carbon away faster than the planet could compensate. With less carbon dioxide, global temperatures fell. The once warm and wet earth began to dry. Swamps retreated. Fires grew less frequent. The breath of the planet shortened. Fossils from this transition tell a subtle but tragic story. In younger layers, the imprints of giant insects grow fewer. The wings become smaller, the leg segments shorter. It is as if the world itself was shrinking its creations, drawing them back into proportion. The atmosphere could no longer support giants. The air that had once lifted them became too thin. Evolution adjusted, quietly, mercilessly. For the creatures themselves, there was no warning, no apocalypse, no firestorm, just a slow fading. Each generation was a little smaller than the one before. The forests thinned, and the great millipedes vanished into extinction, leaving behind only their tracks in the mud. The dragonflies still flew, but they no longer ruled the sky. The air, once their kingdom, had changed allegiance. When paleontologists unearth these fossils today, they are reading the story of a breath turning into silence. A single wing pressed into stone becomes a memory of atmosphere, a signature of air that no longer exists. We can calculate oxygen percentages and chart the rise and fall of life, but what we cannot measure is the feeling of that world, the way it must have smelled after rain, the way the mist must have wrapped around those trees like sleep. Sometimes, when modern scientists recreate those oxygen levels in controlled chambers, they watch insects grow larger, faster, more vibrant. It's as if something ancient stirs in their DNA, as if memory itself remembers what it was like to be vast. But the experiment always ends the same way: too much oxygen, and the system collapses. Fires start. Life suffocates in its own generosity. The lesson seems obvious, yet we keep repeating it. We live now in the opposite condition, not drowning in oxygen but suffocating in carbon. The pendulum swings. Once, the world burned from too much breath. Now, it trembles from too much smoke. The rhythm is the same, only inverted. When we light coal or oil, we are inhaling the past and exhaling the future, feeding the air with ghosts of the Carboniferous. Every flame we kindle is an ancient forest reliving its death. In that sense, the age of giant insects never truly disappeared. It transformed. The balance it sought still governs us. Oxygen and carbon, creation and combustion, breath and ash. The great lesson of that age is not about size or survival, but about balance. How easily it tips, how slowly it heals, how all life is caught between two breaths that never meet. When you think of those dragonflies gliding through a golden mist, remember that they flew in a world of fire and abundance, a world that had to burn itself to stay alive. The air they ruled was both gift and curse. And perhaps, in some quiet way, we are living inside the echo of that same paradox, breathing the same atoms, repeating the same experiment, waiting to see how long the balance holds. The forest that made the sky is gone, but the sky still remembers. Every cloud that passes, every gust of wind, every flicker of flame carries its memory. It waits, patient in the atmosphere. Like a story the earth is still trying to finish. The air of that age carried a sound unlike anything that exists now. A low, endless humming, as if the atmosphere itself were alive. To walk through those forests would be to walk through vibration. Every leaf, every wing beat, every droplet of mist was part of a single trembling network of life. The Carboniferous earth was a symphony played in slow motion, and its music was breath. Oxygen did not merely fill the air, it defined existence. To live, then, was to be surrounded by abundance, by excess, by the heavy perfume of creation that had gone too far. Deep inside that green labyrinth, sunlight rarely reached the ground. The canopy sealed the world in perpetual dusk. Ferns taller than a house stretched their fronds toward gaps of pale light, and their shadows fell across swamps where amphibians waited in silence, their eyes golden and lidless. The trunks of ancient trees, lepidodendron, sigillaria, calamites, rose like pillars of living architecture. Their bark bore patterns that looked carved, geometric, almost deliberate. In the still water below, fallen branches decayed into black silt. Each layer of rot built upon the last until the earth itself became a slow archive of breath, one that would, in time, turn into coal. In this dim paradise, evolution worked like a dreamer. Without predators to limit their growth, insects flourished. The dragonfly Meganeura soared with wings longer than a child's arm span. Its eyes were mosaics of color, each facet a separate reflection of the humid forest below. It hunted by sight, not sound, and in its mirrored vision the world must have shimmered. A living kaleidoscope of green, gold, and flame. Other creatures followed in the air's wake. Spiders with armored legs crept through ferns, weaving webs that glistened in the moist heat. Early cockroaches, their wings edged in copper hues, filled the undergrowth with rustling like rain. Every surface crawled, glided, or pulsed. There were no quiet spaces left, only layers of slow movement. Life folding over life, generation after generation building a world that never slept. And yet, for all its abundance, there was fragility in that balance. The very air that gave birth to these giants was also their limit. The reason is simple and strange. Oxygen made them, but oxygen also restrained them. Modern science explains that insects breathe not through lungs, but through a lattice of tubes, tracheae, that draw air directly into their bodies. The more oxygen fills the air, the larger these networks can grow without starving the inner cells. But when oxygen declines, the system fails. The body can no longer carry breath to its depths. The wings still beat, but the air no longer lifts. So the question remains, did the insects grow large because they could, or because the planet needed them to? Some biologists suggest their expansion was not just biological but ecological, a reaction to oxygen excess, a way for the Earth to use its own surplus. In that sense, the dragonfly's wings were not just an accident of evolution, but a form of planetary respiration. The Earth was using life to balance itself, but all balances fail in time. Around 305 million years ago, the great forests began to die. The continents, once joined in humid lowlands, started to drift. Mountains rose, climates dried, and the wetlands that had sustained the great oxygen bloom began to vanish. Without those vast green lungs, the air grew thinner. Oxygen dropped from 35% to 25%, then lower still. To us, that might sound like a small shift, but for the creatures of that age, it was the end of possibility. Fossil layers record the change like a quiet obituary. The once abundant traces of giant wings and segmented legs become fewer. The size of arthropod remains diminishes with each stratum. Eventually, Meganeura vanishes from the record altogether, as if the sky itself had exhaled and forgotten what it once carried. Only smaller dragonflies continued, adapted to the new air, their wings still glinting with memory. The empire of insects had collapsed, not through catastrophe, but through the slow, invisible erosion of breath. Somewhere between fire and silence, life learned restraint. The reptiles that had crept unseen through the wetlands rose into dominance, built for dry air and harsh light. They would inherit the land the insects had once ruled. It was not triumph, but succession. One form of breath giving way to another. The world did not mourn. It simply shifted its rhythm. When we study that shift today, we find echoes that feel uncomfortably familiar. A world that grows too rich in one element must inevitably correct itself. In the Carboniferous, the excess was oxygen. In ours, it is carbon. Both create imbalance, both feed a temporary bloom, and both demand a price. We look back at that age not just to marvel at its monsters, but to see ourselves reflected in its mistakes. There is something profoundly human in the idea that even air can be too alive. The forests burned because they breathed too well. The insects died because the gift that made them powerful could not be sustained. It's a lesson written in the planet's oldest code. Abundance always asks for balance, and balance always asks for loss. And yet, it is difficult not to feel awe. To imagine a world where the sky shimmered with enormous wings, where the air glowed faintly under the weight of oxygen, where every breath was a reminder of life's excess. In that world, the boundaries between living and dying blurred. Fire and growth, ash and leaf, predator and prey, all part of the same inhalation. If you could stand there now, for even a minute, you would feel it. The soft roar of breath inside everything. You would hear the forest inhaling through its leaves, the insects exhaling through their wings, the water sighing as it turned decay into air. You would understand, in that moment, that the world itself was not a place, but a pulse, a rhythm too large for memory to hold. And when you returned to your own world, when you took your first small, modern breath, you might notice how light it feels, how thin, how fragile. For we are living in the echo of that heavy sky, in the after-image of abundance. We breathe the faint residue of the age of giants, diluted, distant, but still there, suspended in the quiet between heartbeats. As the air thinned and the forests began to retreat, the world entered a slow and sorrowful transformation. The swamps that had once stretched from horizon to horizon began to dry, their green cathedrals collapsing into open plains of cracked mud and shallow pools. The humidity faded, the rain fell less often, and the dense canopies that had made the Carboniferous glow with eternal twilight now stood like skeletons under a harsher, brighter sun. In that fading world, the breath of the planet changed. The oxygen that had once filled every crevice of life began to withdraw, and the rhythm that had sustained giants started to falter. It is difficult to imagine the silence that followed. The great dragonflies, once masters of the air, found their wings heavy. The millipedes, once gliding through fallen leaves like living trains, began to suffocate in their own armor. Even the amphibians that had ruled the water's edge found their bodies unsuited to the new dryness. Fossil evidence from this transition tells of sudden absences, species that vanish between one layer of rock and the next, not wiped out in violence, but erased quietly, like breath fading into stillness. And in their place, a new kind of creature began to rise, smaller, tougher, less dependent on the lush air that had birthed their ancestors. Reptiles. Their skin was dry, scaled, armored against evaporation. Their eggs could rest safely on land. They needed less oxygen, less moisture, less mercy. They were built for endurance. What began as adaptation soon became inheritance. The reptile's breath would one day become the breath of dinosaurs, and later of birds, and finally of us. The giants of the Carboniferous gave their sky to a new lineage of lungs. In the rocks that once held the coal forests, we can still see the outline of this transformation. Beneath the black seams of compressed trees lie the last traces of the old wetlands. Root networks fossilized mid-collapse, pollen grains preserved in silt, the ghostly remains of a world that tried to breathe too much. Above them, younger layers turn red, stained with iron and dryness. The color of rust, the color of oxygen retreating. The world that had been green and wet turned ochre and brittle. For scientists studying this shift, the clues read like a planetary autopsy. Isotopes reveal drops in atmospheric oxygen. Charcoal layers grow rare, suggesting fewer fires. Not because the forests were safe, but because the air could no longer ignite. And in the fossil record, diversity plummets. Entire families of insects vanish, leaving only smaller, humbler forms behind. The rhythm of life had slowed, contracting from grandeur into simplicity. To the planet, this was balance restored. To the creatures that lived it, it was extinction disguised as adjustment. The swamps that once sang with the hum of wings fell silent, replaced by winds blowing over dry stone. It was the end of abundance and the beginning of discipline, but perhaps it was necessary. Every age that breathes too deeply must one day exhale. The Carboniferous had been an age of over-breathing, an atmosphere that had given everything and now needed to rest. The forests that once made the sky had written their legacy into the ground, and from that burial came the coal that fuels our cities today. When we burn it, we reopen the lungs of that forgotten world. The smoke rising from our chimneys is the Carboniferous exhaling once again. It is strange to think that the same chemical breath that once made insects into giants is now reshaping our own climate. In both ages, the planet responded not with anger, but with patience, adjusting, shifting, rewriting the air until balance returned. But balance, in the language of the Earth, often means loss. The cost of correction is always measured in lives. Imagine standing there in those last days of the Carboniferous, the light sharper, the air thinner, the swamps shrinking into isolated basins. You might see a dragonfly circle once more before vanishing into the haze, its shadow passing over the cracked remains of trees that had once reached for the clouds. You might see a young reptile, small, dry, cautious, slipping between stones, its tiny lungs drawing in the air that would soon belong to its kind. The old breath was leaving, but a new one was forming, quieter, steadier. Even in decay, the planet was preparing for what came next. As the continents shifted, mountains rose, rivers carved their way through the bones of old forests, and the air that once burned with fire cooled into calm. The world was emptying itself to make room for another experiment. The Earth's lungs, exhausted from over-breathing, were finally resting. To us, this might feel like loss, but to the planet, it was continuity. The same pulse, slower now, gathering strength for the next inhalation. Every extinction is also a rehearsal. Life disappears in one form, only to reappear in another, rearranged, reframed, reborn under new conditions. The insects shrank, but they did not vanish. The reptiles rose, but they carried the memory of the swamps in their blood. The air that flowed through their lungs still carried traces of the old oxygen, diluted but unforgotten. Even now, when we breathe, we are taking in a fraction of that ancient atmosphere. The nitrogen, the carbon, the oxygen molecules have cycled through billions of lives, billions of deaths. The air we exhale tonight may once have filled the wings of a dragonfly, or fueled the flame that burned an ancient tree to ash. The planet has never truly exhaled all of the Carboniferous. It lingers, folded into the chemistry of our breath, sometimes, late at night, when the air is still and damp, when you can hear the faint trill of insects hidden in the dark. It feels like the world is remembering that age. The sound of wings, the pulse of heat, the thickness of humidity. They are not gone, only quieted. The ghosts of that forest still move through us, patient and invisible, reminding us that every breath carries a history older than words. And perhaps that is the truth buried in stone, that life is not a story of progress, but of repetition. The air learns, forgets, and learns again. The planet breathes in giants, exhales silence, and then, in time, begins another cycle. We are part of that same oscillation, caught between inhale and exhale, living inside the pause between eras. When the swamps finally fell silent, the earth did not die. It only changed its voice. The sound of buzzing wings gave way to the hiss of wind across dry plains, and the air that had once shimmered with life became something thinner, quieter, more cautious. The age of giant insects had ended, though the planet itself did not seem to notice. The atmosphere had shifted, the balance restored, and the world exhaled a long, cooling breath that would carry it into the next chapter of deep time. In the sediments of that transformation, a pattern emerges, one that is neither random nor merciful. Each age of excess becomes the seed of the next restraint. The Carboniferous gave birth to coal, and coal gave birth to memory. The air, stripped of its abundance, began to change its character. Oxygen sank back toward the levels we know today, and with that subtle shift, everything else followed. The forests that had once created the atmosphere withdrew, their descendants smaller, more efficient, less grand. The insects that had ruled the canopy shrank, not because they failed, but because the world no longer needed their size. Nature, having tested the limits of breath, decided to dream smaller. But the fossils left behind still tell of a different kind of grandeur, one not measured in size, but in persistence. In some coal seams, trapped beneath layers of shale, scientists have found wings so finely preserved that the veins still catch light. In others, the impressions of bark still bear the delicate patterns of Sigillaria's skin, geometric and hypnotic. These are not relics of destruction. They are pages from a book that the earth continues to write. The insects and plants of the Carboniferous did not vanish completely. Their legacy runs through every breath of air, every flicker of flame, every cell that knows how to use oxygen without drowning in it. Still, the story of that age feels more like a warning than a memory. It shows how easily the balance between creation and ruin can tilt, how the very forces that make life possible can, when amplified, begin to undo it. Too much oxygen turned forests into kindling and air into a slow fire. Too much carbon, as we now know, warms oceans and melts ice. The chemistry changes, but the pattern does not. The planet breathes in abundance, exhales correction, always in cycles, always with consequences. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, the world's shape began to harden. The continents drew closer, forming the supercontinent Pangaea, a vast single landmass where heat pooled and seasons sharpened. The endless swamps drained away, replaced by deserts that stretched for thousands of kilometers. In the geological record, the color of the rocks changes from black to red. The dark, waterlogged mudstones of the coal forests giving way to oxidized sandstones baked in dry air. The earth had turned its lungs inside out. And yet, even in this desolation, life endured. Reptiles expanded into the open world, exploring new terrains that insects had never reached. The air might have lost its thickness, but it had gained clarity. Skies deepened from green to blue. The horizon reappeared. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, sunlight fell unfiltered across the continents. What was lost in mystery was gained in definition. The world had learned to see itself. The smaller insects that survived the transition adapted quickly. They no longer needed giant wings or thick armor. Some developed new forms, early ancestors of modern beetles and roaches. Their size made them invisible to the shifting atmosphere, and their adaptability became their strength. They would outlive the reptiles, the dinosaurs, even us. The giants had perished, but the miniature inheritors carried on, proving that evolution does not favor the mighty, but the subtle. In a way, this quiet persistence mirrors the human story. We, too, live in the aftermath of excess, building worlds from what previous ages have left behind. The oxygen that once lifted Meganeura now fills our lungs. The carbon that once fueled those forests now powers our cities. We are made of their remains, animated by the breath of their extinction. The Earth recycles not just matter, but meaning. Each age leaves behind a vocabulary of survival, a grammar of balance, that the next must learn to read. There is something deeply humbling about realizing that the air around us is ancient, that every breath we take contains molecules that once brushed the wings of a dragonfly or drifted through the canopy of a coal forest. The oxygen we breathe is not new. It has simply been passed from one form of life to another, again and again, like a secret too important to forget. Even now, some of those same atoms that once lit ancient fires move through us, quietly keeping our cells alive. The past does not disappear. It circulates. Perhaps this is why the story of the Carboniferous feels so haunting. It is not just a story about insects or forests, but about the fragility of balance, the way the planet dreams, overreaches, and then learns restraint. We often think of extinction as an ending, but the Earth does not end. It transforms. The giants died, but their chemistry became ours. Their failure became our inheritance. And still, the question remains, how many times can the Earth breathe this way? How many cycles of excess and correction can it endure before the rhythm falters? We like to believe that balance is eternal, but the rocks tell another story. One of long pauses, sudden silences, and recoveries that take millions of years. Every species that has ever lived has been both beneficiary and casualty of that rhythm. None have escaped it. To stand in a modern forest, breathing freely under a blue sky, is to stand in the echo of that ancient experiment. The air feels light, but it carries the weight of deep time. You are inhaling the residue of forgotten fires, the ghost of giant wings, the quiet intelligence of a planet that once learned how to breathe too much. The world that followed the age of giant insects was smaller, drier, more disciplined. But within that contraction lay the foundation for everything to come. From the ashes of the coal forests, evolution wrote a new chapter, one that would lead to mammals, birds, and finally, us. The giants were gone, but the memory of their air remains. It lingers in the pulse of wind, in the shimmer of dragonfly wings still tracing the same ancient pattern across ponds and rivers. The age of excess had ended. The age of endurance had begun. And in that quiet shift, the planet continued its slow, endless breathing. The inhale of creation, the exhale of loss. A rhythm that has never truly stopped. The silence that followed the retreat of the great forests was not empty. It was heavy, almost sacred. The earth seemed to pause, as though exhausted from its own abundance. For millions of years it had breathed too deeply, filled the air with fire, fed its creatures with air so thick they grew enormous and strange. Now, the breath slowed. The humidity thinned. The oxygen fell. The planet was exhaling, carefully, painfully, like a body recovering from fever. In the places where swamps once shimmered, the ground hardened into plains of cracked clay. Rivers carved through the sediments of the old forests, revealing veins of coal, the compressed remains of generations that had lived and died in the humid dark. To walk there would be to walk on history itself, though no living thing yet knew what history was. The world had entered the quiet between two pulses. The insects had shrunk, the trees had withered, but something else, something quieter, had begun to stir. Those new creatures were not born from water or mist. They were born from dryness. The first true reptiles had emerged, their lungs refined to breathe thinner air. Their eggs, sealed in leathery shells, no longer needed to rest in ponds. They could hatch in dust, under the open sun. Evolution had found a way to liberate life from water entirely. And with that, the planet crossed an invisible threshold, one that would define every creature that followed. The age of air had become the age of land. Fossils tell us that these reptiles were small, unremarkable, almost timid compared to the giants that came before. But that modest size hit a revolution. The Carboniferous had been a dream of expansion, plants reaching upward, insects swelling outward, yet it had ended in collapse. The New World would learn from that mistake. Efficiency replaced excess. Survival became the new form of grandeur. The giants were gone, but the architects of endurance had arrived. The forests that remained changed too. The towering club mosses and ferns gave way to conifers, trees with needles instead of broad leaves, built for arid air and harsh light. They no longer spread by spores but by seeds, each one a small capsule of patience, a promise that could wait years to awaken. The planet was adapting, shifting from the lush immediacy of the Carboniferous to the slow, measured tempo of the Permian. Every detail, from bark to breath, reflected restraint, and yet, deep below, the old world was not gone. Beneath the red deserts and dry hills, the swamps still whispered. Trapped in coal and shale, in gas and oil, the Carboniferous continued to exhale its memory. The energy of that age, its light, its humidity, its endless breath, had not vanished. It had merely been stored. Millions of years later, when humans would drill and burn, they would unlock it again, unsealing the lungs of a world that had once suffocated on its own abundance. The past was not buried. It was waiting. Scientists studying this transition see it as one of the most profound rebalancing acts in Earth's history. Oxygen levels fell sharply, perhaps by a third. Carbon dioxide crept upward again, warming the air slightly, but drying the land. The result was a planet of contrasts. Great red deserts cut by narrow rivers, wide basins filled with salt, and isolated wetlands where the last remnants of the ancient forests clung to life. The insects that survived were smaller, their breathing systems refined for scarcity. The reptiles spread across the continent, slow but unstoppable. Evolution was pruning the excess, shaping the future through discipline. Still, something of the old world lingered, not in form, but in atmosphere. There must have been moments when a wind swept through a dying forest and carried with it a scent of rot and sweetness, the perfume of an age that refused to fade. There must have been dragonflies still tracing the air, their wings thinner now but still glinting in the light, their flight paths repeating the old rhythms. The ghosts of the Carboniferous did not vanish overnight. They dissolved gradually, like breath fading on cold glass. The Earth seemed to remember that age even as it moved beyond it. The chemistry of its air still oscillated, seeking balance. The soil still held the carbon of its lost forests, and the creatures that came next, the synapsids, the precursors to mammals, inherited the lungs and metabolism shaped by that long experiment with oxygen. Every inhale we take today is a continuation of that legacy. The ratio of gases in our atmosphere, the efficiency of our breathing, even the fragility of our climate, all are echoes of that first imbalance. There is something deeply cyclical in this, something that feels less like history and more like ritual. The Earth tries, fails, adjusts, and tries again. Life expands, collapses, begins anew. The Carboniferous was a masterpiece of expansion. The Permian, its quiet repentance. Together, they form one complete breath, the inhale and exhale of a living planet. And perhaps that is what makes the story so haunting. It is not simply about insects or oxygen or evolution, but about rhythm, the way life pulses through excess and scarcity, the way creation and destruction are not opposites but phases of the same movement. The air that once lifted giants now sustains us. The coal that once fueled trees now fuels our cities. We live inside their exhalation, repeating their cycle with every spark we ignite. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The faint hum beneath modern silence, the echo of wings across a vanished sky. Every gust of wind carries atoms that once brushed against dragonflies the size of birds. Every flame we light is the resurrection of forests that breathed 300 million years ago. The Carboniferous never truly ended. It transformed into memory, and that memory lives inside the atmosphere itself. Some nights, when the air feels thick and the world goes still, it's easy to imagine that the planet is remembering again. The breath deepens, the oxygen rises, the fires return. History does not repeat itself in time, but in chemistry. The elements remember even when we do not. And if the balance tips once more, if our own excess awakens that old rhythm, the planet will correct itself, as it always has, patiently, impersonally, through the long and quiet act of breathing. In the quiet that followed the collapse of the Carboniferous, the planet seemed to hold its breath. The air that had once pulsed with energy now drifted thin and cool, its lush density replaced by distance and silence. Where jungles once steamed and hummed with wings, a pale sun rose over barren flats of stone. The world had traded abundance for stillness, color for endurance. The giants were gone, but their absence spoke louder than their reign ever had. The age that came after, the early Permian, felt like a long morning after a fever. Everything was sharper, harsher, more awake. The atmosphere, once thick enough to cradle enormous insects, had thinned. Oxygen levels dropped to near modern proportions, and the earth, stripped of its humid lungs, began to breathe in short, dry intervals. Evolution responded in kind. Creatures became leaner, harder, more deliberate. Life no longer reached outward in excess. It folded inward, conserving energy, preparing for a different kind of struggle. Across the supercontinent of Pangaea, winds carried dust where once they carried spores. The air burned by day and froze by night. The swamps that had birthed the great coal forests were now scattered oases, small and temporary. What had once been a planet of shadow and water became one of sun and rock. It was, in many ways, a new world, one that no longer sang but whispered. Yet beneath that silence, the memory of the Carboniferous still stirred. The ground beneath the deserts held the compressed breath of the vanished forests, seams of coal running for miles beneath the surface. When the wind blew over cracks in the earth, the smell of ancient carbon still escaped, faint and sweet, like smoke that had waited 300 million years to rise. The planet was not empty. It was storing its history. In that new clarity of air, the sky deepened into a blue that had never existed before. The haze of the old oxygen-rich atmosphere was gone. Sunlight reached the ground unfiltered, and for the first time, shadows were sharp. To a modern eye, this might have been beautiful. To the creatures that lived then, it was deadly. Without the protective mist, the land dried faster. Rain came in violent bursts, carving gullies through red stone. The once gentle world of ferns and dragonflies had hardened into one of extremes. But change for life is never truly loss, only transformation. Out of this new dryness, evolution sculpted resilience. Reptiles expanded across the continent, their scaly skin conserving every drop of moisture. Their bodies learned to regulate heat. Their hearts grew stronger, their lungs more efficient. The chemistry of the atmosphere had reshaped the chemistry of life. The experiment that had begun with oxygen excess was now refining itself through scarcity. What survived was not size, but stability. And yet, in hidden corners, the descendants of the old world persisted. In wetter valleys and along the edges of shallow seas, small ferns and insects still clung to the memory of the Carboniferous. Fossil sites from this time reveal a strange coexistence. New reptiles walking among the remnants of ancient flora. Dragonflies still hovering above rivers that would soon dry forever. It was a world of overlap, one age fading as another took form. The breath of the past still lingered, faint but unmistakable. When scientists study the chemical signatures of this transition, they see evidence of the Earth's self-correction. The drop in oxygen was not random, it was reaction. Too much oxygen had made the world flammable. Too little carbon had cooled it. The death of the coal forests released carbon back into the air, warming the planet again. The balance had reset. The Earth, through catastrophe, had healed itself. There is a strange comfort in that. The idea that the planet has always known how to breathe, even when it seems to suffocate. That the same feedback loops which destroyed the giants also prepared the ground for new beginnings. From the outside, extinction looks like failure. But to the Earth, it is rhythm. Expansion, contraction. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle burning away excess until only what is necessary remains. The early Permian became the forge where that necessity took shape. The insects that had once ruled the sky now shared it with the first flying reptiles. Primitive gliders that would one day give rise to true flyers. The forests, though smaller, grew tougher, rooted deeper. Even the soil began to change, turning red with oxidation. A sign that the planet was breathing differently. The oxygen that once fed infernos now rusted iron instead. Fire had become memory, written into the stones themselves. It's easy to romanticize the Carboniferous, its lush abundance, its impossible creatures, its surreal atmosphere. But perhaps its beauty was inseparable from its instability. The Earth is not designed for permanence. Every paradise carries the blueprint of its undoing. What made that age so magnificent was also what made it brief. The dragonfly's wings were not symbols of triumph, but of fragility. Thin membranes stretched between two worlds, lifted by a chemistry that could not last. Even so, that brief moment changed everything. The oxygen-rich air of the Carboniferous permanently altered the planet's geology and biology. It built the carbon reserves that would power future ages. It sculpted the physiology of land dwellers. It taught the biosphere the meaning of balance, a lesson written not in language, but in breath. When we speak of life adapting, we are really speaking of life remembering. Perhaps that is why the age of giant insects still fascinates us. It was not simply a world of monsters, but of thresholds, a time when the planet experimented with scale, with excess, with the chemistry of possibility. It showed how vast and reckless life could become when given too much of a good thing, and how quietly, inevitably, that abundance turns to ash. Today, when we look into the mirror of our atmosphere, rich again in imbalance, filled not with oxygen but with carbon, we are seeing the same lesson repeating. Different gases, same rhythm, a planet remembering an old mistake. The story of the Carboniferous is not distant. It is returning. We are living at the edge of another breath. Another moment when the Earth must decide whether to exhale or burn. And so the air around us carries two stories at once. One of creation, one of warning. In every breeze, in every breath, the memory of that ancient world still moves, unseen, unforgotten, waiting to remind us what happens when the planet breathes too deeply again. The air after the Carboniferous collapse carried a strange calm, like the long sigh that follows a storm. The oxygen that once fed colossal fires and fueled the wings of giants had ebbed, and what remained was a thinner, quieter world. It was a planet between breaths, still warm, still alive, but subdued, as though it had learned the cost of excess. In this new balance, the forests grew sparse. Where endless jungles once sprawled, dry woodlands began to take their place. Conifers and seed ferns replaced the ancient club mosses. Their roots dug deeper, their leaves narrowed, their trunks toughened against drought. The world was moving away from softness and abundance toward endurance and restraint. To survive now meant to hold something back. Every leaf, every breath, every heartbeat learned to do more with less. And yet, the old air still lingered underground. Beneath these new forests, the planet's hidden lungs, the coal seams, waited, preserving the Carboniferous in silence. Those black layers, rich with the ghosts of ferns and dragonflies, carried within them an energy so immense, it could one day remake the world. It would take millions of years before anyone could touch that buried breath. But it was already there, folded in time, waiting to return as fire. The insects that had once ruled the skies no longer soared as gods. The great dragonflies, their wings too vast for thinner air, dwindled. Their descendants adapted, smaller, lighter, quick to dart between sunlight and shadow. Evolution had no sentimentality. It simply adjusted to the new pressure. Size was no longer an advantage, efficiency was. What once floated effortlessly now struggled. But those that learned to live smaller survived. In a sense, the entire world was learning the same lesson. Abundance had proved unsustainable. The air could no longer hold so much life without consequence. The fires of the Carboniferous had shown that too much oxygen turned beauty into disaster. The earth, as if chastened, shifted toward moderation. And with moderation came a new kind of intelligence. Not conscious, but systemic. An instinct written into the chemistry of survival. Some scientists describe this as the Earth's self-regulation, a network of feedback loops that balance climate, atmosphere, and life. But standing back, it feels almost emotional, as if the planet itself were learning patience. In the Carboniferous, it had dreamed in green excess. In the Permian, it dreamed in red dust. Between those two colors, the story of respiration continued, the eternal cycle of giving too much, and then learning restraint. In fossil beds scattered across what was once the ancient equator, we find traces of both worlds layered together. Charcoal bands from the fires of the high oxygen age lie beneath sandstones of arid plains. The shift between them marks the moment Earth drew breath inward. The swamps had dried. The insects had shrunk. The amphibians had given way to reptiles. But even in this desolation, evolution was not retreating. It was refining. The reptiles that emerged from this crucible would one day become the architects of entire eras. Their lungs were models of precision, adapted for thin air and long drought. Their skin, sealed against water loss, was an invention of genius, a design that could endure where softness failed. For the first time, life could move freely across continents, no longer bound to the mercy of the wetlands. The planet's surface, once divided into islands of habitability, opened like a map. The world was harder now, but larger. It is strange to think that the very collapse of one system became the foundation for another. The age of giant insects did not truly vanish. It transformed into energy for what followed. The oxygen-rich air had written its lesson into every genome, every ecological pattern that came after. In a sense, we owe our lungs, our ability to breathe this thin modern air, to that distant excess. We are descendants not only of survivors, but of the failure that reshaped the atmosphere itself. Even now, the remnants of that world still lie beneath our feet. Every flame that burns coal, every spark of electricity drawn from fossil fuel is a whisper from the Carboniferous. We are reawakening that ancient breath, feeding it into a new atmosphere, repeating a cycle older than memory. The world that once burned from too much oxygen now warms from too much carbon. The pattern remains, a planet rediscovering imbalance, one breath away from correction. And yet, perhaps there is beauty in that repetition. It means the Earth remembers. It means that time is not a straight line, but a rhythm, a pulse, a breathing pattern written into stone. The collapse of the Carboniferous was not a failure, but a necessary pause. The inhale before the next exhale, the silence between two waves. The insects, the forests, the oxygen, all were part of a single inhalation that had simply reached its limit. What remains haunting is not their extinction, but their perfection. For a brief moment, the chemistry of the planet and the anatomy of its creatures aligned perfectly. Air and life in equilibrium, wings and wind in harmony. The dragonflies were not monsters, but metaphors. A reminder that life's most delicate creations are often born from imbalance. The planet breathed too deeply, and for a moment, it dreamed of flight. When the air grew thin again, those dreams folded their wings and sank into the soil. But they did not disappear. Their atoms scattered, their oxygen dissolved into the global atmosphere, their carbon buried to wait for rediscovery. We breathe them still. The same molecules that once filled the lungs of amphibians and the veins of ferns. The Earth has been recycling that breath for hundreds of millions of years. Every inhale we take is, in truth, ancient air. Sometimes when you stand in a modern forest and the humidity thickens around you, you can almost feel it. That echo of the Carboniferous world. The smell of wet leaves. The sound of insects humming unseen, the soft glow of green light filtered through mist. It is the planet remembering its own heartbeat. The same pattern of breath continues, stretched across epochs, rising and falling like tides in the lungs of time. And if you listen long enough, the silence between gusts of wind might begin to sound familiar. It is the same silence that came after the giants fell. The same pause that always follows excess. The Earth still carries their memory, not as tragedy, but as wisdom. A quiet understanding that every age must end so that the next can breathe. By the time the last of the coal forests vanished, the Earth had already rewritten itself. The planet that had once been drowned in green had turned bronze and red, a continent of heat and distance. The very air felt different. Thinner, sharper, drier, as if it had been purified through the long, slow fire of time. The oxygen-rich haze that had once wrapped the planet like a dream was gone. In its place came clarity, and with it, exposure. The Carboniferous had ended, and the Permian had begun. In that clarity, something profound took shape. The world, for the first time, began to resemble the one we know. Open skies, visible horizons, vast inland deserts, and climates that demanded adaptation rather than indulgence. The lush amphibian paradise of the Carboniferous had collapsed under its own weight. In its ruins, the age of endurance was born. The creatures that survived, reptiles, seed-bearing plants, and small, efficient insects, were no longer children of abundance. They were children of scarcity, shaped by a world that had learned how to breathe cautiously. The Earth's very colors changed. The black soils of the swamps became red beds of oxidized iron. The atmosphere, once dense with moisture, turned transparent, letting sunlight blaze unhindered across the surface. Geologists can still trace this transition in rock layers. the dark, carbon-stained shales giving way to brilliant bands of rust-red sandstone. It is the story of air, told in pigment, the portrait of a planet cooling, drying, learning, and beneath this transformation, deep underground, the memory of the old forests endured. Each coal seam was a trapped lung, holding the breath of an age that could no longer exist. For millions of years, these black veins lay dormant, sealed under pressure and silence. It would be humanity much later that would open them again, tapping into that ancient oxygen, releasing the ghosts of dragonflies and ferns back into the modern sky. Every fire, every engine, every flicker of electricity today is a resurrection of that buried world. When we light our cities, we are lighting the Carboniferous from within. But for the creatures of the early Permian, the future was unwritten. The reptiles thrived, spreading across Pangaea's endless plains, their scales glinting like armor under the sun. They carried with them a quiet victory, the ability to exist without dependence on the vanished swamps. Their eggs could rest on dry ground. Their lungs could draw thin air without struggle. They were survivors not of strength, but of discipline. And within their small, leathery bodies lay the blueprint for all that would follow: the dinosaurs, the mammals, and the eventual return of flight in new, unimaginable forms. The insects that remained seemed like echoes of their ancestors. They no longer filled the sky like drifting leaves. They hid among the ferns, lighter now, quieter. The age of spectacle was over. The age of subtlety had begun. Yet in their design, nothing essential had changed. Their tracheal system still mirrored the rhythm of the planet. Networks of tiny tubes pulsing with breath, like miniature versions of the Earth's atmosphere itself. The same geometry that once allowed wings to span half a meter now allowed them to survive at a fraction of that size. Adaptation is never surrender. It is memory, refined. The landscape, though harsher, had its own beauty. Imagine standing on one of those new dry plateaus. The sky above is a deeper blue than anything seen in the swamp-bound ages before. The wind carries the taste of salt and dust. To the west, the skeletons of ancient forests jut from eroded cliffs, black and glimmering, the exposed roots of time itself. And across the horizon, a reptile moves slowly, each step deliberate, its shadow stretched long in the unfiltered light. This is what survival looks like after paradise. Slower, smaller, but infinitely wiser. What happened to the Earth's atmosphere during this time remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in geology. How did oxygen levels drop so dramatically? Some researchers believe the answer lies not in catastrophe, but in evolution itself. As new microbes and fungi evolved to decompose wood more efficiently, the massive burial of carbon that had once fueled the oxygen boom began to slow. The planet's breath steadied. Decay caught up with growth. For the first time, the cycle of life and death found balance. It's difficult not to see meaning in that. The idea that life corrected its own excess. The Earth was never at war with itself. It was learning equilibrium. The Carboniferous forests had oversupplied, and fire had punished them. Now, the planet had learned restraint, not through divine design, but through chemistry. Every living thing became part of that lesson. Breathing itself, that act we take for granted, is a negotiation between need and limit, between taking in and letting go. The story of the age of giant insects is therefore not just about scale or extinction, but about the intelligence of balance. It shows how beauty and danger can be the same thing, how abundance can turn to poison, and how the Earth, through time, always finds its way back to the center. The world that followed was less dramatic, perhaps less dazzling, but far more stable. a foundation upon which complexity could finally grow. In that stability, evolution built wonders. The first forests adapted to drought. The first mammals' ancestors began to warm themselves from within. The sky, though empty of giants, awaited new masters. Creatures that would one day rediscover flight under different rules. The air was no longer thick enough to lift a dragonfly the size of a bird, but it could carry the song of something else. An intelligence that would, much later, look back and try to remember what the air once felt like. Sometimes, when scientists measure the carbon trapped in ancient coal or the oxygen isotopes in fossil amber, they are doing more than chemistry. They are eavesdropping on a breath. They are listening to the planet inhaling 300 million years ago. And what they hear is a rhythm both alien and familiar, the same that moves in our chests, the same that rustles the leaves outside your window tonight. We live on a planet that still carries that memory in its air. The oxygen that fills our lungs, the carbon that builds our bones. Both are remnants of that experiment. Every storm, every flame, every breath we take is a continuation of that ancient inhalation. The age of giant insects may have ended, but its lungs never closed. They simply became the world we breathe in now. The silence after abundance has its own kind of gravity. Once the fires faded and the wetlands turned to dust, the earth seemed to drift into reflection. The age of giant insects had not simply ended. It had folded into memory, buried under layers of ash, water, and time. The swamps that had once hummed with wings were gone, and the creatures that depended on their air had followed them into extinction. Yet the planet did not grieve. It simply adjusted, as it always does, rebalancing its chemistry with slow, unseen precision. The atmosphere that once shimmered with oxygen had stabilized to something close to what we breathe today. The fires no longer leapt spontaneously from lightning strikes. The air grew cooler, thinner, drier, an atmosphere that no longer fed giants, but thinkers. For the first time, life had to learn efficiency instead of excess. To survive now meant calculation, patience, and control. Every species that remained had to master a new art, the art of restraint. In the fossil record, this shift appears almost like a change in mood. The exuberant sprawl of the Carboniferous gives way to the clean, minimal lines of the Permian. Plant diversity narrows but deepens. Species that survive become more resilient. Insects grow smaller, but their forms become more intricate, more refined. Wings folding neatly, bodies armored in complexity. Reptiles emerge as disciplined architects of adaptation. The entire biosphere feels as though it has taken a deep, steadying breath. The dragonflies, the icons of that earlier age, lingered for a while longer. Their descendants glided through the new forests, smaller but still ethereal, their wings catching the sun in flashes of silver and gold. Each flight was an echo of something greater, as if the air still remembered its former density and lifted them out of habit. But the magic was fading. The old chemistry could not return. The planet's breath had changed forever, and yet the story did not end in loss. It evolved into something quieter but more enduring. The creatures of this new atmosphere, reptiles, beetles, seed-bearing plants, carried within them the code of survival that would shape the next 200 million years. The lungs of reptiles, more efficient than amphibian gills, would one day become the lungs of mammals and birds. The conifers, born of drought, would outlive every age of abundance that followed. Evolution was no longer experimenting wildly. It was perfecting. The transformation of Earth's air became the foundation of everything that came after. Oxygen stabilized near 21%, just enough to sustain complexity, but not enough to ignite catastrophe. It was the perfect compromise between life and fire. This balance, delicate and ancient, is the same one that sustains us now. The breath you take this moment is tuned to the same chemistry that replaced the Carboniferous excess. Every inhale is a product of that correction. Every exhale is part of its continuation. To the geologists who study it, the Carboniferous remains a paradox. It was both the most alive and the most unstable period in Earth's history. Its forests gave us the coal that powers our civilization, but its oxygen nearly destroyed the planet that created it. It was an age of perfect contradiction. Abundance that led to absence, creation that demanded fire. The Earth learned through that mistake. We perhaps have not. When we burn coal today, we are not merely using ancient fuel. We are awakening the Carboniferous again. We are releasing its oxygen, its carbon, its ghosts, reopening the breath the planet had long since closed. The heat rising from our cities is the same chemistry that ended that earlier paradise. The planet remembers that pattern. It knows what happens next. Still, there is something profoundly human in our fascination with that world. Perhaps it speaks to a longing for a time when the Earth itself seemed more alive, when even the air was thick enough to lift dreams. We look at the fossils of Meganeura, the dragonfly with a wingspan wider than our shoulders, and we feel awe, not fear. We imagine that vast breathing forest, its light dim and golden, its creatures alien yet familiar. We are drawn to it because, in a way, it feels like a memory rather than a myth. If you stand in a modern swamp at dusk, when the air is humid and still, when mosquitoes hum and dragonflies hover like pieces of moving glass, you are closer to that ancient atmosphere than you might think. The same microbial symphony plays beneath the surface. The same slow decay feeds the air. The chemistry is gentler now, but the rhythm is unchanged. You are breathing the end of that world and the beginning of your own. In those moments, the line between past and present feels thin, as if the planet's breath is a single continuous thread, winding through epochs, weaving extinction and creation into one long inhalation. The Carboniferous is not gone. It lingers in the air, in the ground, in the blood. The carbon in your body, the oxygen in your lungs, the heat that flickers in your cells, all were born from that ancient balance, that fleeting experiment when the world tried to live too fully. Perhaps that is why this story feels both vast and intimate. It is not just geology, it is autobiography. The Earth's lungs are our lungs. Its corrections become our crises. We are made from the air that once burned and from the silence that followed. The end of the age of giant insects was not a tragedy. It was a lesson in proportion, a reminder that every form of beauty, if left unchecked, will consume itself. And yet, even knowing that, we repeat it. We chase excess again, not in oxygen, but in carbon, in warmth, in speed. The Earth, patient as ever, allows it, knowing that the next correction is inevitable. The same chemistry that humbled the dragonflies waits quietly in our atmosphere, gathering itself for the next exhale. When that breath comes, slow or sudden, it will not be revenge. It will be balance. The same law that governs lungs and leaves, fire and decay. The same cycle that turned the humid jungles of the Carboniferous into the stone and air of today. The planet will breathe out once more, and everything that has lived too long on borrowed air will fade into silence. But from that silence, something new will rise, as it always has. A different air, a different rhythm, a new form of life to remember the old one. Just as we remember the dragonflies, the breath of Earth will continue, unbroken, from one dream to the next.